The day I stepped back onto Halewood training grounds, the air felt heavier than I remembered. Maybe it was the way the sun cut through the clouds in thin surgical lines, making everything look sharper, cleaner, more unforgiving. I wore a standard issue recruit's uniform. No stripes, no medals, no insignia, nothing to betray who I was or what I'd done before. That was the point. To them, I was just another new arrival, another set of boots to break in, and another file for the archives. But under the plain fabric and steel-toed leather was a history they'd buried years ago, a history that still pulsed with every step I took. I had learned a long time ago that walking into enemy territory doesn't always involve crossing borders. It can mean walking right back into the arms of the people who once tried to destroy you. This place was more than a base. It was the stage of my humiliation, my exile, my death on paper. I kept my face still as the line of recruits shifted forward, eyes fixed on the flagpole where the colors swayed in the breeze. The chatter around me was the usual mix: nervous jokes, loud boasts from kids barely out of high school, and the dead silence of the ones already realizing they'd made a mistake signing up. I was neither. I wasn't here to serve again. I wasn't here for redemption. I was here for one thing: to finish a war that had started long before any of them could spell my name. The whistle blast tore through the air like shrapnel. Everyone froze, spines locking, boots snapping together. My eyes drifted upward toward the platform, and there he was, Colonel Matthew Rains, my father. His uniform looked like it had been pressed by angels, every crease perfect, every ribbon aligned with surgical precision. His face, unchanged by the years, was still carved in stone, and just like that, the smell of dust and diesel faded, replaced by a memory I had tried to burn out of my mind, the day he erased me with nothing more than a signature. He scanned the roster in his hand, eyes flicking over names until they landed on mine. For a second, nothing. Then his jaw tightened. The pause was deliberate, loud enough for everyone in the field to hear. He said, "Rains Harper, unfit for service." His voice was calm, clinical. The words were a scalpel, slicing cleanly through whatever anonymity I'd brought with me. A ripple of laughter rolled down the rows. Some recruits smirked. Others exchanged knowing glances, happy to see someone else stumble before the race even began. The instructors didn't move. They'd seen hazing before, but this wasn't that. This was something colder. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes on the horizon like I hadn't heard a thing. That was the first lesson you learn when you've been hunted by your own people. Never give them the satisfaction of seeing you bleed. He wanted me to look small. He wanted me to look like the nothing he'd spent years convincing the world I was. The irony was almost funny, because standing there, boots still dusty from the bus ride, wearing a uniform so plain it could have belonged to anyone, I had more power than he could possibly imagine. Not the kind you wear on your chest or the kind they pin to your lapel in a ceremony. This was the kind you carried deep in your bones, in the silence of the nights no one saw, in the scars no one asked about. He thought I was here to fight for a place. He didn't know I already had one. He thought this was the beginning of my test. He didn't know he'd already failed his. The whistle blew again, snapping everyone into motion. We marched toward the barracks, the crunch of gravel under our boots mixing with the faint roar of distant gunfire from the live fire range. My hands stayed loose at my sides, my steps measured. Inside, I was already scanning the ground, marking the cameras, counting the guards, memorizing every detail. The war I'd come to fight wasn't the one they were training for, and the first battle wasn't going to be waged with rifles or in the dirt. It was going to be fought in shadows, with truth sharp enough to cut through the lies they'd built their empire on. They didn't know it yet, but their reckoning had just walked in through the front gate. The night it happened, the air smelled like rain. even though the desert hadn't seen a drop in weeks. I was 29 then, running black ops missions so far off the books they might as well have been written in invisible ink. Our team had been dispatched to a no-name stretch of dirt along the border, tasked with extracting a defecting asset. It was supposed to be clean, quick, and quiet. It wasn't. From the first moment our boots hit the ground, something felt wrong. The usual chatter over comms was stilted, too precise, like everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first wrong move. Falco, our commander, and the man who had trained me from the day I joined intelligence, kept his tone light, but I heard it in his breathing. He knew something I didn't. We reached the rendezvous point ahead of schedule, a half-collapsed shack surrounded by cracked earth and scattered tin. The target was nowhere in sight. No footprints, no heat signatures, just silence. I was scanning the perimeter when a single shot cracked the air. It came from behind us. The first hit wasn't mine. It dropped Cole, the youngest on our team, before he even had a chance to return fire. The second blast hit the ground near my feet, throwing shards of rock into my legs. My instinct was to move forward, to push through the kill zone, but Falco's voice cut through the chaos. "Harper, back to me. Now!" I sprinted toward him, firing at the shadows cresting the ridge. We weren't dealing with smugglers. These were professionals. Their formation, their movement, it was ours. Then came the sound I'll never forget. A hollow thud, a beat of silence, and then the world ripped apart. The explosion was close enough to lift me off my feet. My helmet cracked against the ground, my vision stuttering in and out. The taste of metal filled my mouth, and all I could hear was the ringing, endless and sharp. Through the haze, I saw Falco pushing me behind cover, his own body taking the brunt of a second blast. He didn't get back up. I tried to drag him, half blind, muscles screaming, but more fire rained down on us. My comms were dead. The air was thick with dust and gunpowder. And then, as I reached for his sidearm, I saw it, painted in crude white on the side of a crate, a symbol I recognized from our own supply drops. Our own people had been here first. When the dust cleared hours later, I was the only one breathing. My arm was torn open. My ribs felt shattered, but I was alive. Or so I thought. It took 2 days to crawl back to our extraction point, stealing water from enemy caches, stitching my own arm with fishing line from my survival kit. When the evac chopper finally arrived, I thought it was over. But instead of a medic's blanket, they handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Harper Rains, Kaya, Friendly Fire, 23:47 hours. Signed, stamped, and dated. The order had been processed before I'd even made it back. They didn't want me home. They wanted me gone. The official line was that I'd died pulling 3 diplomats out of a blast zone. The reality was that someone inside had fed us to the wolves, then lit the match themselves. And whoever it was, they'd made sure my name was crossed off before my body was even cold. Weeks later, in the back room of a safe house, I learned the truth. A contact slid a folder across the table, his eyes avoiding mine. "It came from high up," he said, "real high. Same signature on both the mission order and your death notice." The signature was clean, sharp, and painfully familiar. My father's. That was the night I stopped believing in protocol. That was the night Harper Rains died on paper, and that was the night I decided that one day, no matter how long it took, the people who orchestrated that blast would regret leaving me alive. When people hear the word father, they picture someone who teaches you how to ride a bike, who claps the loudest at your school play, who shows you how to knot a tie before your first formal event. My father, Colonel Matthew Rains, taught me none of those things. He taught me how to load a rifle before I was 12. He taught me that hesitation was weakness. He taught me that loyalty was a transaction. From the outside, he was the perfect officer, highly decorated, immaculately disciplined, respected by his peers, feared by his subordinates. His name carried weight in the Pentagon. His handshake could open doors my entire unit couldn't breach with explosives. People looked at him and saw a war hero. I looked at him and saw a man who could erase a life with the flick of a pen. I knew that because he had done it to mine twice. The first time was when I was 25, already on the short list for Project Sentinel, the most elite intelligence program in the service. I had passed every evaluation, scored higher than recruits with double my years, and had a personal recommendation from Commander Falco himself. Then, without warning, my name vanished from the selection board. The official note read, "Psychologically unfit following combat exposure." It wasn't true. Every report, every file, every interview I'd given told the opposite story. But none of that mattered once my father's signature was on the paperwork. No one challenged it. No one even asked. And just like that, the opportunity of a lifetime was gone. The second time came years later, after Blackline 6 was disbanded in disgrace, and I was clawing my way back towards something resembling a career. My name had quietly surfaced for a new advanced operations unit. I didn't even know until I saw the internal memo, my name highlighted alongside other candidates, and then, just like before, my candidacy was stamped denied with the same sharp signature in the corner. When I confronted him back then, before I knew how deep the rot went, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply said, "You're not fit to lead." And that was the end of the conversation. No explanation. No room for argument. He walked away as if my future had been his, to assign or destroy us from the start. Most people assumed our distance was because I'd chosen intelligence over infantry, that I'd taken a coward's path instead of following in his combat boots. The truth was far uglier. My existence reminded him of something he couldn't control, Falco's choice. Falco had been his peer, his rival, and the man who had chosen me over him for leadership. That decision had cracked something deep inside my father, and he'd spent the years since trying to prove it wrong. When word came that he'd been assigned senior command at Halewood Training Grounds, I knew it wasn't just a posting, it was a throne. From there he could shape doctrine, decide careers, and bury names so deep no one would remember they'd ever existed. That was the battlefield I was stepping onto when I re-enlisted. Not a war of bullets and bombs, but one of paper and politics, where my father's pen had been the deadliest weapon of all. He didn't know I'd forged my way in this time, bypassing every gatekeeper he thought he'd trained. He didn't know I was already inside the walls of his fortress. And he sure as hell didn't know that the same daughter he'd twice erased had come back not just to survive, but to dismantle the kingdom he'd built on other people's graves. Rock bottom isn't a single moment. It's a slow erosion. One day you're standing on solid ground, the next you're knee-deep in water, and before you realize what's happening, you're drowning in it. After the blast that was supposed to kill me, after the false obituary, after I learned whose hand had signed my death into existence, there was no dramatic collapse, no screaming fit, no whiskey bottle thrown against the wall, just a quiet unraveling. The military had been my anchor since I was 17. Every rank, every mission, every bruise was a stitch in the fabric of who I thought I was. When they cut me loose, they didn't just take my career, they tore away my identity. I became a shadow in my own skin, a ghost in every room I walked into. I spent the first year after dying in a string of safe houses, moving every few weeks. Not because anyone was chasing me, no one hunts what they think is already dead, but because I didn't know how to be still. Stillness meant thinking, and thinking meant replaying every second of that night in the desert. The smell of the explosives, the way Falco's hand shoved me behind the cover, the sound of his body hitting the dirt and not moving again. It was easier to keep moving, to pretend I was tracking something when in reality the only thing I was chasing was a reason to keep breathing. Money came in under the table, favors from old contacts, odd jobs that required skills you couldn't list on a resume. I forged documents for defectors. I smuggled medicine into places no aid group would enter. I intercepted arms deals just to burn the product before either side could use it. Small, messy victories in other people's wars, but inside I was hollow, not just from grief, but from the gnawing realization that the man who should have stood in front of me had stood behind the order to erase me. That knowledge poisoned everything. It turned every small act of survival into a question. What was the point of living if the life I'd built had already been buried? Then came the lowest moment, 3 years after my death. I was working dockside in a coastal city under the name Lena Hart, unloading crates for a company that didn't care about my past as long as I could lift 50 pounds without complaint. One night, during a shipment delay, one of the foremen switched on the TV in the break room. A military graduation ceremony filled the screen, and there he was, my father. Standing on the podium, handing out commendations, smiling like a man who had never once buried his own daughter's name in an unmarked file. The camera caught him shaking hands with a young recruit, a boy whose posture and haircut screamed molded in Rain's image. He looked proud in a way he had never looked at me. That was the moment I understood the truth. My erasure hadn't been about my mistakes, my fitness, or even my survival. It was about control, about shaping a legacy that didn't include me, and something inside me shifted. Not in anger, not yet, but in clarity. If he had gone to such lengths to erase me, then my existence must threaten something he valued. And if I could figure out what that was, I could take it from him. It wasn't a plan, not yet, but it was the first spark in years. The first ember of a fire I thought had gone out in the desert. I didn't know how long it would take, or how many masks I'd have to wear, but I knew one thing for certain. When I came back into his world, it wouldn't be as the daughter he once knew. It would be as the ghost he couldn't kill. Transformation doesn't happen in a straight line. It's not a clean arc from broken to whole. It's jagged, uneven, full of dead ends and wrong turns. For me, it began in the places most people avoid, the underground gyms with flickering lights, the abandoned warehouses where the smell of oil and sweat clung to the walls, the out-of-the-way bars where soldiers went to disappear. I didn't start by plotting revenge. I started by rebuilding the only thing I could trust, myself. My body had been torn apart in that blast, my muscles wasting from weeks of limping through the desert, my lungs weaker from the dust that had clawed at them. I needed strength again, but not the kind I'd had before. I didn't want to be match fit for the military. I wanted to be something else, unpredictable, harder to read, harder to stop. Every morning, I trained until my vision blurred, weighted runs in steel-toed boots, grappling drills until my shoulders screamed, knife work in a back alley until my wrists ached. I didn't train for trophies, I trained for endurance, the kind of endurance you need when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and still expected to walk away breathing. The nights were for my mind. I devoured everything I could on asymmetric warfare, counter-surveillance, psychological operations. I broke down patterns of manipulation in military hierarchies, studied the language of false reports, learned how to bury and unearth files without tripping alarms. I built a map, not of terrain, but of people, how they moved, who they feared, what they hid. I wasn't alone in this. Along the way, I started finding others like me, cast-offs, whistleblowers, operatives who had been burned by the same system that raised them. They weren't friends. Friendship was a luxury I couldn't afford. But they were useful, and I was useful to them. We traded skills, favors, information. One was a former logistics officer named Grace, who could make a supply chain disappear with nothing more than a phone call. Another was a disavowed sniper called Vance, whose left eye was clouded white, but who could still put a round through a coin at 200 yards. And then there was Jules, an analyst who had walked away from a promising career after refusing to falsify a mission report. They became my shadow network, people who didn't ask too many questions and didn't care about my real name. It was Jules who brought me the first thread that led back to my father. She handed me a flash drive across a cafe table without looking up from her coffee. Training doctrine revisions, she said. Halewood's running new programs, covert conditioning, psychological pressure disguised as leadership drills. Ring any bells? It rang more than bells. It was the same rot that had poisoned Black Line 6. The same manipulation Falco had fought against before the program was gutted, and it was happening under my father's watch. That was the moment my purpose shifted. Surviving wasn't enough anymore. It never had been. I wasn't going to just live in the cracks of the world they'd built. I was going to tear the foundation out from under them. So I spent the next year preparing for one thing, getting inside Halewood. It wasn't easy. My face was still on file, even if the record said deceased. I needed a new identity, one that would pass the deepest clearance checks without raising a flag. It took months of quiet forgery, planting digital breadcrumbs, creating a history for someone who had never existed. A mid-level policy advisor named Harper Lane, average grades, average fitness, specializing in interdepartmental morale audits, boring enough to avoid scrutiny, important enough to get access. When I was ready, I sent in the application through a clearance channel, so old it was practically invisible. Weeks later, the reply came. Approved. Report to Halewood Training Grounds for initial assignment. The day I read that, I didn't feel triumph, I felt stillness, because the moment I stepped back through those gates, the war would start again. And this time, I wasn't coming to fight for my place, I was coming to take theirs. The gates of Halewood loomed ahead like the mouth of something that swallowed people whole. I'd walked through them once as a young cadet, full of ambition and blind faith. This time I came as Harper Lane, mid-tier policy advisor, an invisible cog in a machine that thrived on hierarchy and neglecting the parts it thought didn't matter. That was my camouflage. My forged personnel file painted me as harmless. Civilian background, a bland work history in administrative oversight. No combat experience worth noting. I'd even inserted a few deliberate inefficiencies in my fake records, minor delays on old projects, a misfiled requisition form, small flaws that made me unremarkable. People trust the forgettable. The reception officer barely glanced at me as I signed in. He handed me a temporary badge without making eye contact. Too busy scrolling through his phone. Perfect. No scrutiny, no questions. Just another body to push paper and sit quietly in the back of meetings. My quarters were in the East Wing. Older, dimly lit, smelling faintly of rust and old paint. A perfect vantage point. From there I could see the main quad and the western drill fields if I kept the curtains cracked. The bed was stiff, the radiator hissed, and the walls carried whispers from the hall. It suited me fine. I hadn't come here for comfort. The first week I did nothing but observe. I learned who barked orders for show and who barked because they didn't know any other way to speak. I learned which sergeants sabotaged their own recruits to pad the performance of their favorites. I learned who deferred to my father without question and who only saluted because they had to. My father didn't acknowledge me, not once. He passed me in corridors, in the mess hall, on the parade grounds, his eyes skimming over me as if I were just part of the wallpaper. That told me two things. My disguise was working, and he had no idea the war was already inside his walls. The real gift came 3 weeks in, when Lieutenant General Foster arrived unannounced. I'd known he was still active, but seeing him here felt like a silent promise. Foster had served with Falco. He knew what Black Line 6 had been before it was twisted into something unrecognizable, and he knew the truth about my death. We crossed paths in the mess hall. No words, just a glance, a pause, a barely there nod. That was all it took. Later that night, a knock came at my door, 2 short, 1 long. I opened it to find him standing in the shadows. "You'll work from Sector C," he said quietly. "No clearance above level 3, keep your head down. No one can know who you are, not yet." I nodded. "And my father?" "Let him think you're a nuisance," Foster said. "It's the perfect cover." From then on, I moved carefully, asking innocuous questions during policy reviews, requesting access to training footage under the guise of compliance checks. Most of my requests were denied, but every denial was a breadcrumb. The refusals told me what they didn't want me to see. Tier 4 isolation drills, volunteer endurance tests, mental conditioning exercises under the name of leadership building. It was the same poison doctrine from years ago, polished and hidden under new labels. Then one night, Foster slid a small drive across a table in the mess hall. 1 hour, he said. The footage was grainy, but the truth was sharp. Recruits blindfolded and locked in confined spaces. Betrayal simulations where team members were pitted against each other. Instructors using fear, humiliation, and psychological collapse as teaching tools. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just remembered. I remembered Falco slamming his fist on a table and saying, "We train warriors, not machines." This wasn't training. This was programming, and it was being run in my father's house. By the time I closed the file, my path was set. I would tear this program out by its roots. But not yet. First, I needed to plant seeds, quiet, invisible seeds that would grow into cracks he couldn't plaster over. Because the surest way to bring down a fortress isn't to charge the front gate. It's to make it collapse from the inside. The first strike had to be invisible. If my father even suspected I was moving against him, the game would end before it started. He'd bury me a 3rd time, and this time he wouldn't leave a heartbeat behind. It began with paper. That was his kingdom, the neat stacks of reports, the forms signed in triplicate, the memos that passed through his desk like they were gospel. I started altering them, not with anything blatant, but with small, precise edits. Training schedules mysteriously overlapped with maintenance closures. Performance reviews for his loyalists were misplaced, causing delays in their promotions. Equipment requisitions were rerouted to underfunded units, forcing his favorites to make do with faulty gear. The first time I saw him frown during a morning briefing, I knew the infection had taken root. He blamed the supply chain, the clerks, anyone but himself. That was good. It meant he didn't see my hand yet. My second front was the war games. Every month, Halewood ran large-scale simulations. Mock combat meant to test unit cohesion. I used them to sow doubt. In one drill, I quietly fed altered topography maps to an opposing unit, allowing them to flank one of my father's pet officers. In another, I swapped radio frequencies between squads mid-operation, creating chaos without a single shot fired. The results were subtle but measurable. His inner circle began to question each other. Whispered accusations replaced easy camaraderie. The clean, sharp machine he'd built was beginning to grind in its own gears. I thought I was controlling everything, but just a week later, I realized someone was controlling me. A string of strange incidents began to happen, and not all of them were my doing. One night, while scanning through old internal files, I came across a report. The signature authorizing one of the weapons shipments used in the 2017 ambush belonged to Grace, the person I'd always considered the safest link in my outside network. I didn't believe it was outright betrayal. Maybe she didn't know, but at Halewood, not knowing was sometimes the most elegant way to help. Then came the personnel shift. I started spending more time in Bravo unit, the so-called dumping ground for the underperformers, the ones written off before they'd even had a chance. They were used to sabotage, they were used to losing, which made them perfect. Fisher was the first to notice. He'd been one of my loudest hecklers when I arrived, quick with a jab, quicker with a smirk, but when I started quietly slipping him intel before drills, his wins came faster. His smirk changed. It wasn't mockery anymore, it was curiosity. Then there was Megan Nuon, sharp, disciplined, better than half the golden recruits, but buried under false failures after she filed a misconduct report on an instructor. I documented her story in my black notebook, knowing it could one day be a match against the fuel I was stacking. Word spread in the quiet way it always does in places like this. If you were overlooked, if you'd been sabotaged, Harper Lane would notice, and she'd even the odds when no one else was watching. But the moment I knew I had struck a nerve was during the Lost Protocol drill. It was designed to test a unit's response to losing their leader mid-mission. My father had always twisted it into a spectacle, publicly breaking the chosen officer for failure while the others watched. This time, I maneuvered the assignment so one of his most loyal lieutenants was in the hot seat. The man crumbled under pressure, just like the recruits he'd mocked for years. My father tore into him in front of the entire command tent, and in that moment, I saw it. The shift in the eyes of the instructors. They weren't looking at the lieutenant anymore. They were looking at my father, and they were seeing him for what he was. Not a flawless leader, but a man who thrived on erasing others to keep himself untouchable. That was my first strike. Not a direct blow, but a whisper through the ranks, a splinter under the skin. And once it was in, I knew it would only fester. The fortress was cracking, and he still didn't know the ghost inside was the one holding the hammer. The unmasking didn't happen in a burst of fanfare. It happened in a moment so quiet it was almost anticlimactic, at least until the ripples hit. I thought I had gathered enough pieces to flip the entire board, but just when I believed I held the upper hand, a hand landed on my shoulder and whispered, "You're being watched." In the dark, I turned, ready to draw my knife. But it was Lieutenant Harris, only 27, and we'd never met before. He spoke in a low voice. "Falco saved my life in Kandahar. If you're doing something he would have supported, then I'll help you through the final door." I didn't answer, but I knew another door had just opened, and maybe another trap had just been set. It began with a file. Not the kind you stumble across by accident, but the kind someone risks their career or their life to hand you. Fisher was the courier. He appeared in the weapons maintenance lot one overcast afternoon. No smirk, no swagger, just a folded sheet of paper creased like it had been clenched in his fist for hours. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said, shoving it into my hands before I could speak. Inside was an internal operations log from 2017. The date was burned into my memory, October 3rd, the night of the blast. It listed my name, my unit, the mission code Blackline 6, and the words presumed KIA friendly fire. Every line of the debrief was redacted, except for one signature at the bottom. My father's. I'd known for years. But knowing and holding the proof in your hands are two different beasts. Proof changes everything. Proof can topple kings. That night, I slipped into the command wing. His office was empty. No surprise, he was probably in the officers' lounge, drinking and rehearsing speeches about leadership. I placed the document in the center of his desk. On top, I left a single torn page from my black notebook. Do you want to sign it yourself this time? No threats, no explanation, just the truth delivered like a blade wrapped in paper. 2 days passed, nothing. On the third morning, I was summoned to a full formation review on the parade grounds. The entire base was present, recruits, instructors, senior staff. My father stood at the podium, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable. There is one file I was handed, he began, but it contains no rank, no commendation, and no official record. It is too vague to acknowledge. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Every pair of eyes in that field found me, and so I will not. He stepped back, dismissing me without a word, without even looking at me. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and then the silence broke, not with applause, not with orders, but with the sound of another set of boots approaching the podium. Lieutenant General Foster. He didn't touch the microphone, didn't address my father. He simply walked to the table of training records, placed a weathered red folder on top, and rested his hand on it. There was once a unit that didn't officially exist, he said. Its members had no birth dates, no death notices, no graves, only outcomes. It was called Ghost Echo. Its final mission was Black Line 6. Murmurs rippled through the formation. My father's jaw tightened. I was there when its commander was declared dead, Foster continued, declared by people who feared the questions she would raise. She came back not to reclaim what was taken, but to protect what was left. Her name is Harper Rains. He opened the folder. My photo stared back at them. Full tactical gear, sand still clinging to my shoulders, eyes hard, with the certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. Foster turned to me. You now outrank everyone on this ground. And then he saluted. Not as ceremony, but as acknowledgement. One by one, the others followed. Megan, Fisher, recruits who'd once mocked me, instructors who'd tried to fail me. Even the officers who'd built their careers on my father's approval, all except him. He stood frozen, eyes locked on mine. For the first time in years, I stepped forward and spoke directly to him. You taught me the importance of chain of command, I said, my voice steady. So now, as your superior officer, stand down. He didn't speak. Didn't salute, but his gaze dropped to the ground, and for a man like him, that was the closest thing to surrender I'd ever get. The shock didn't explode all at once, it rippled. Like a detonation you hear in the distance, then feel in the soles of your feet moments later. After the formation broke, the base wasn't the same. Whispers clung to every hallway. Salutes came slower, with hesitation, like each soldier was recalibrating what they thought they knew about the hierarchy. For some, the salute was respect. For others, it was survival. The first to approach me was Megan. She didn't smile. She wasn't the type, but her posture was straighter than I'd ever seen. My record, she said quietly. They reinstated it. I already knew. Foster had seen to that before we'd even stepped onto the field. Still, hearing her say it felt different. She'd fought her own private war, and for once the truth had won. Fisher didn't come to me in public. I found his bunk stripped, locker empty. A note waited where his pillow used to be. You never needed to prove it anyway. 7 words, nothing more. But I understood. He was gone, transferred to a place where his edge would be put to use, somewhere my father's reach couldn't follow. Not everyone was gracious. A captain from my father's inner circle cornered me in the admin wing, his voice low and hot. "You've humiliated him. You've humiliated all of us." I didn't flinch. "If humiliation is what the truth feels like," I said, "then maybe you are standing in the wrong formation." By the end of the week, my father's office was locked more often than it was open. Rumor said he'd tendered his resignation. Others whispered about a reassignment far from any command post. I didn't need to confirm it. Men like him didn't stay where the shadow of their own disgrace stretched longer than their authority. On the 6th night, I found an envelope slid under my door. My name, my real name, was written on it in his precise, deliberate handwriting. Inside was a single black and white photograph. 2 cadets in pressed uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder. One was my father, the other Falco. On the back, in ink pressed deep enough to leave dents in the paper, were 10 words. He chose the wrong man back then, but not now. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't absolution, but it was the closest he'd ever come to saying I was right. And for me, that was enough to close the chapter. The change in Hellwood was subtle at first. Recruits began questioning instructions, not out of defiance, but from a place of wanting to understand. Instructors stopped using humiliation as a teaching tool. Files were reviewed with more eyes, less rubber stamping, and for the first time in years, Bravo Unit wasn't a dumping ground. It was producing some of the top trial scores on the field. The ripples kept spreading. I heard from Grace, the logistics officer who'd helped me on the outside. That word of what happened had made it into the upper echelons. People were asking about Ghost Echo again, about Black Line 6, about the names attached to missions they'd been told never existed. Every question was a crack in the wall that had kept the truth locked away, and I didn't have to swing the hammer anymore. The cracks were widening on their own. My father never came to me again. I think he knew there was nothing left to say, but I knew that every morning he woke up, he'd have to live with the knowledge that the daughter he'd tried to erase now stood taller than the legacy he'd spent his life protecting. That was the real victory. Not the salute, not the title, but the fact that the truth had outlived the lie. When the dust settled, I didn't stay. I could have. Foster made that clear. There was an open seat at the table, a chance to reshape Halewood from the inside, to rebuild what my father had rotted. But I knew the danger of lingering in a place that had tried to bury you. If you stay too long, you start breathing its air again. You start thinking in its language, and I wasn't going to let myself be molded by the same walls I'd just torn down. I left with nothing but my black notebook, the photograph my father had given me, and one sealed scroll from Foster. He handed it to me at the gates on the morning I departed. "Final declassification," he said. "Black Line 6 is officially closed. No more shadows." I didn't open it, not because I didn't care, but because I already knew what it meant. For years, I'd been the last living thread of a mission that officially never happened. Now it belonged to history, not rumor. I moved to a weathered warehouse by the coast, a place without flags or titles, where the sound of the tide replaced the cadence of drills. It wasn't a training center, not in the formal sense. It was a refuge for the unseen. They came one by one. Veterans discarded for being too outspoken, recruits who had been failed out because they didn't fit the mold, immigrants with accents mocked by instructors who thought uniformity meant sameness, women told they were too soft for command, men told they were too stubborn to follow. Here, none of that mattered. There were no commendations, no ranks. No one here was training for a parade. We trained for the moment no one sees, the decision in the dark, the step forward when everyone else takes a step back. I taught them the way Falco taught me. No ego, no false bravado, only the question, Can you do the right thing when no one's watching? It took months before I unrolled Foster's scroll. At the bottom, beneath the official seals and signatures, was a single handwritten line. You weren't trained to lead. You became a leader by surviving. I slid it into the back of my notebook, behind Megan's testimony, Fisher's note, and the file that had once pronounced me dead. Not out of nostalgia, but out of order. Those pages belonged together. The lies, the truth, the small victories. Sometimes, at night, I'd walk the length of the training floor and think about Halewood, about the recruits who still marched under its flag, about the instructors who might now think twice before breaking a soldier in public. I wondered if my father still wore the uniform. I wondered if he still believed in the stories he told himself to survive his own reflection. But mostly I thought about the ones who would never set foot inside Halewood or any place like it, the ones who'd find their strength without a badge or an anthem, the ones who'd learned to stand, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. Revenge had been my compass for so long that I almost didn't notice when it stopped pointing forward. Somewhere along the way, I'd crossed a border. I wasn't walking toward him anymore. I was walking toward something else, something bigger. So here's what I know now. You don't need permission to exist. You don't need their signature to matter. Every day you wake up and refuse to disappear, you're writing your own clearance. And if someone ever tries to erase you again, write your name back in. Not with their ink, but with your own, in the work you do, in the choices you make, in the fact that you stayed when leaving would have been easier. Because in the end, that's the legacy no one can take. Not even a man with all the power in the world and a pen sharp enough to kill.